Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Kelly, the CEO of Small Business Michigan.
Good afternoon. Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Communications. We appreciate you being here. Brian, we've invited our colleague Kelly Saunders back for the two of you to have a discussion on the governor's budget presentation that happened yesterday.
Yeah, I thought it would make sense to cover some of the items, at least the items that intersect with SBAM agenda, or small business agenda items that are impacted by the budget and the governor's budget presentation. Now, just as kind of a disclaimer, the budget presentation and the report or the presentation that comes with that, it often lacks like intimate detail, which won't really be available till the bills are introduced that have all the different line items and the boilerplate, so we can really kind of get to the bottom of it. But we can get a broad overview of some of the items that and the priorities in the budget that we have presented by the governor yesterday. So the first thing, Kelly, would be just kind of an overview of the budget. How big is the budget that the governor is presenting?
Well, thanks for having me back. Again, Kelly Saunders, Vice President of Policy and Engagement here at SBAM. We were just joking that I'm like the political correspondent here in Lansing at this point, but glad to be with you. But yes, Governor Whitmer did present her budget yesterday. Also important to make the notation that this is the governor's budget presentation. The legislature will now take that budget and make their own recommendations, and the negotiation will begin between the governor and the legislature to decide where those priorities will lie. So we're seeing firsthand what the governor wants to focus on, but will that line up with the legislature's priorities? So very interesting. But for the governor, it is an $80.7 billion budget. Believe it or not, that is a slimmed down budget from last year. As you recall, we had talked about how last year's budget was one of the biggest that we have ever seen. And so this is slimmed back, we'll say. General fund total 14.3 billion, school aid at 19 billion. She does plan to invest in the rainy day fund, which currently sits at 2 billion, to bump that up to 2.2 billion. And a couple just interesting things overall. 4.4 million directly to speed up permitting, specifically around environmental issues, and 4.8 million to increase childcare facility inspections. We obviously talked about childcare a lot here. So those are the highlights, I would say, that don't fit into certain categories that we're going to go through. But also a very interesting point that she brought up, paying down the MIPSers early to release 670 million. And Brian, I think you have some more background on that you could give some context to as well.
Yeah, so that MIPSers is the teacher retirement system, and there's a lot of education dollars have to go in to pay what had accumulated over generations deficits in the teacher pension system, which during the Snyder administration, there were big investments every single year or contributions made to chip away at those shortages, and so the governor's feeling like now enough progress has been made since then to consider part of that deficit. They still have to make contributions to the pension fund, but part of that deficit to be made up, and therefore over 600 million can go to the classroom instead of paying off the pension debt. So a couple things for context. So we've got 80.7 billion. It was 82 billion last year. So last year was the biggest ever. This year is the second biggest ever. So not a record, but not too far off the record. So I know you kind of ingest a slimmed back budget, but some other context just from a historical perspective. Back in 2011, it's only a dozen years ago, that the budget was about 46 billion. So it's a pretty big difference over that period of time. So they'll feel a little tight this year, even though it's not, it's still a very large budget. They've been used to big year-over-year increases. This year won't be an increase. So let's talk a little bit, Kelly, about timing before we get into the issues. What do you expect in terms of the process when the budget moves, when are the kind of the milestones, when does this all get settled?
Yeah, great question. It was actually kind of a funny moment yesterday when the governor was done giving her presentation. She said to the joint appropriations committees, and I look forward to getting this done by the end of May. And there was a nervous laughter because this budget process is long and arduous, and there are numerous demands and goals that are set by both the House and the Senate about numbers they want to reach at a certain time after they have their priorities on the table. And when the governor exited, her budget director Jen Flood said, I could sense the nervousness in the air. Let's just know we need to get this done by June 30th. And so while the governor was very anxious to get this completed, the budget director kind of signaled as long as we're done by June 30th. So kind of a funny moment yesterday.
Yeah, and that's June 30th is is kind of an unofficial modern day deadline. It used to be that it would go right up until the day before the new fiscal year, which was September 30th, or sometimes into the fiscal year with those short-term government shutdowns. Been a while since that's been the case, but the idea of getting it done before the 4th of July. Yeah, I'll go ahead and make a prediction here, though, that I think that that they'll have it done earlier in June, not because it'll be any easier this year, but because it's an election year and they're going to be chomping at the bit to get out there and working on election items. All right, let's talk about some items that we have some interest in, starting with education. We're a founding member, SBAM is, of Launch Michigan, so education reform, one piece of that is funding. There's accountability, transparency, the standards that are taught to, and then the governance issues. It's a big agenda. Part of it's funding. Tell us a little bit about the education budget.
Well, going to continue to share some large numbers with you, but Governor Whitmer has always said education is a central part of her administration. She did recommend a 2.5% increase per pupil funding, which is an additional $241, bringing that to just under $10,000 per pupil. The largest ever, obviously. Did offer $300 million for continued mental health services in schools, $200 million for the continuation of her free breakfast and free lunch program that was instituted last year. In addition to that, she also proposed providing those services in the summer to students that would need that, which is an additional $500,000 in that line item. That's also a drawdown from a federal program. And so that is a new proposal. 159 million for pre-K for all. If you recall, MyLeap, which you mentioned at the beginning of the program, was charged with speeding up the governor's goal, providing pre-K for all through students throughout Michigan. And so 159 million. How that breaks down is that would put an additional 8,600 kids into pre-K. 42.8 million of that would be a full day increase for allocation for those students to be in the classroom, 35 million for new classrooms to be started up for underserved areas, and 18 million additional for transportation of those students to those classrooms. And then also for special education, 127 million and 125 million for at-risk students, which essentially closes that gap, which Brian, I know you are well versed in this space, so maybe you want to provide context there. But also 45 million for vocational educational upgrades and technology for students that may be seeking certifications coming out of high school rather than traditional college university type setting. So a pretty robust education budget, and we'll be a part of specifically that pre-K for all, making sure that if we don't want our child care providers to get pushed out of the market because this initiative is put into place. But MyLeap is very aware that we need to take care of our child care providers, and that was touched on a little bit throughout the other budget, which we'll touch on in a few minutes.
Yeah, and that's on the those items, these are increase items, of course. As you'd mentioned, it's a $19 billion budget overall, so it has a lot of different components in it. And some of those, something like vocational or career and tech education in high schools, that kind of continuing the process of beefing that back up, of course, a very positive thing. That the per pupil allotment, is getting up pretty close to $10,000 per student. And this is one of the areas where I do expect a little bit of debate on is just a flat per pupil allotment. Does that make sense? If you were to look at the Launch Michigan education reform framework, it would recognize that some kids have higher levels of need and are much more expensive to educate. And it makes sense to try to have a funding formula that recognizes that. So poverty is one of those things. Special education is one of those things. But the if one thing that very urban areas and very rural areas have in common is that they have higher levels of poverty and lower educational attainment. And so what it takes to overcome poverty is sometimes in terms of achieving still high standards in education is can be just more expensive. And so it's one of the areas I think will probably, while the governor has put a lot into just the overall per pupil allotment, I think as it goes through the process, there'll be some discussion regarding how to ensure that the kids that have some bigger obstacles in front of them have what they need. And the mental health services in schools that's a pretty big number for that. Now we'll see how well it gets deployed. I know there's been a bit of a skirmish between the governor's office and the Department of Education regarding releasing some early childhood education money from last year's budget that's still kind of sitting in the coffers. So hopefully implementation is something that is really well planned for in this process. We have, so let's move on then to higher education. So we have person interest in what happens after high school. So many of I was looking at some stats earlier that there has been about a 400% increase in the number in the jobs in Michigan that require post high school or secondary education, credentialing, certification, degree attainment. What's happening in higher ed?
Well, we know, Brian, you said on the Growing Michigan Together Council, in this area specifically, we felt that their report on higher education was going to be very crucial to stopping that population shrinkage we talked about. And so I would say that there's a nod to the Growing Michigan Together Council recommendations in this budget by the governor. So a 2.5% increase to university and community college operations, specifically to achieve the governor's 60 by 30 goal, which is 60% of our adult population would have a certificate or a base level degree in order to help attain higher wage paying jobs. And so a bump there, 30 million for the Michigan Achievement Scholarship Program, which was started last year. She also is pivoting to calling this the Michigan Guarantee, which if you recall in her State of the State address, she wanted to provide free community college for every high school graduate that wanted to attend community college to upskill in a certificate or to receive their associate's degree. And so this new term is called the Michigan Guarantee. And then 62 million to continue the Michigan Reconnect program, which we obviously have been very supportive of in the past and continue to be to this day. If you recall in the last budget, there was a lowering of the age from 25 to 21. There is an intention to continue or to keep the age at 21 rather than going back up to 25. And we really don't have a problem with that, but we want to make sure that there are checks in the system to make sure that this program has accountability measures in place to make sure that it's successful. And so from an allocation and a deployment perspective, we are very supportive of this. However, there has to be accountability measures in place to make sure that the benchmarking of people going through the program is successful. So we're encouraged by this piece of the budget to see that those pieces are being put in place to make sure that Michiganders are in the best position possible to upskill to get into the workforce.
All right, very good. And then there is they kind of highlighted economic development, and we have heard from a lot of different sources that having a kind of a new economic development package, different tools, funding old tools is a priority for the governor. I did note that SOAR, the Strategic Outreach and what's the A stand for? I can't remember now. But anyway, SOAR is a big business incentive. You give, like, the build a new factory and say it gives a couple $100 million or something for somebody to do that. So I saw that they asked for 500 million. I'll be very, very surprised the legislature goes along with putting more dollars into SOAR. But there was kind of an earmark built into the tax system previously, which was $500 million. The legislature still has to appropriate that. This would be kind of an interesting point of confrontation. So we can kind of set that aside because we've talked a lot about SOAR. But what else was put in terms of economic development that our people might be interested in?
Yeah, so I think we had updated our viewership on specifically the research and development tax credit and our interest in making sure that our membership would be able to have access to a tool like that. And we had worked with many of our peers in the business community to shepherd an R&D tax credit legislation through the House at the end of last year. And that did get through, and it's currently sitting in the Senate. But the governor recommended, in combination with that, $100 million to be set aside for R&D. And we love that. We want to make sure that the legislation is sound. And so we're hopeful that the Senate will act on it in its current form. So that'll be available to small business owners. Agnostic in every industry. We worked really hard to make sure that it was simple to file for. And so we're really encouraged that maybe with the governor's emphasis on this, that will start to get through the legislature and be available in the future. But $60 million for an innovation fund, which is specific to startups only. This is a new tool, I'll say, that she unveiled in her State of the State address. And I think, Brian, to your point with SOAR, that's not really our baby by any means, but that has had some stumbling blocks in the legislature and with her as well. I think this is a new tool, an economic development tool that she's introducing and trying to get as a part of that package rather than focusing on SOAR. And then $20 million to build off of the Pure Michigan campaign to add $15 million of currently allotted in general fund. We support the Pure Michigan campaign. We see a lot of value in it. To see that get support from the governor and have that extra oomph is welcomed. We hope that the legislature will also do the same. They have been resistant to it in the past. However, we are hearing from some of our legislative partners that they do want to make it a focus. And so that was welcome news as well. $20 million for community revitalization projects. $20 million for Going Pro, which is a one-time funding on top of the $54.8 million already allocated, another program that we support wholeheartedly. Welcome news there too. $20 million for specialized economic assistance businesses. We're not quite clear where that's going, but we're going to dig into that. And then $4.4 million for global talent attraction and retention. That has a lot to do with the work we do with Global Detroit. And we really believe in that work as well, making sure that students who come here and are interested in working here, getting them in the talent pipeline to gain experience, but then also immigrants that are coming here choosing to make Michigan their home, making sure that they are, taking credentials they may have gotten in another country, getting them in line with the rules and regulations here to get them in the workforce sooner rather than later. And that was also a focus of the Growing Michigan Together Council in making sure that we're supporting new Americans here in Michigan to make sure that they are creating a great way of life. And so we, in the economic development piece, we're actually really happy with what we were seeing. And so we'll have to see what the legislature grabs onto. But overall, pretty good news in this category.
Yeah. Yeah, that is one of the global Detroit, or the idea of retaining more talent. We do have a lot of international students who spend time in Michigan universities, but they don't really have a good way of staying after they get a great education and are able to contribute to the economy here, and then literally they're required to leave. It's interesting. I recently came across or learned about growth in Canada, and um, with the Toronto area, basically the Greater Toronto area, that whole province. And their population growth in recent years has been as impressive as Florida. And of course, they don't have the climate that Florida has. So what's behind that? And it turns out that they have a really good system to catch people that the U.S. educates and then makes leave. And so they're really building a whole population growth strategy out of it, and it's working beautiful for them. Why not retain more of that talent here? While that's a pretty minor piece of the budget, strategically could be a pretty important part of our future. So there's a few other things I wanted to touch on. One, I just wanted to lightly mention on infrastructure. SBM does have an infrastructure support agenda where we like infrastructure that works well is important to us, but not one based on debt. One of the few ways of funding infrastructure that we don't support. The state did borrow a fairly large amount of money back in 2019, which has funded a bunch of these freeway projects, so M roads and I roads, but especially the I roads. Uh, that a lot of these projects have been funded on borrowed money. The end of that is this year, so um, this budget includes the last tranche of that borrowed money. Starting next year, it will fall off a cliff. Road funding will reduce for two reasons. First is borrowed money will be spent, be gone, and then also the payments will start on the loans that were taken out for the last 5 years worth of projects. So one of those areas where, yeah, if you have several extra projects, big projects because of that borrowed money, but also long term, you still got to pay for it. And I don't know if the project on 96 and 696 is ever going to get done, but at this point I'll take the potholes if they'll just let people drive through that unencumbered. All right, so that's on infrastructure. Last thing I wanted to talk about was housing. We do recognize that there's a housing crisis. There's already significant resources, state and federal resource, about 1 billion allocated. The budget actually gave us some insight on like what do we get for that 1.4 billion?
Yes. So MISTA, what the governor said was they have done a great job of managing their resources to be able to put their back into putting a $1.4 billion investment into housing in Michigan. As you recall, we share a great relationship with Director Hovey, and we do believe that she does manage a great department. And so that is for building and rehabbing homes throughout Michigan. The stock would be 10,000 new and existing homes that would be renovated or built in this proposal. Important to note that this is to use MISHDA's current purchasing power and bonding in order to do so. And so while housing is a main legislative focus for us, we do believe that communities have to be strong and have housing stock in order for our small businesses to thrive and have places for people to live. We know that people prefer to live closer to where they work. This is welcome news. We will definitely be following it to make sure, that those monies are used in an effective manner. But in the sense of it being, with Director Hovey and her tenacity and her know-how in this space, this could be transformational for our communities and our housing stock in the future.
Yeah, big numbers, got big shortages, and this will take a bite out of it. Probably a couple 100,000 units short in Michigan of what ideally we would have. So you got to start somewhere, and a pretty ambitious 10,000 unit goal for the state. So Kelly, excellent as usual. Thanks for keeping track of all this and for joining us on the briefing today.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yes, thank you both for that thorough coverage. I know I learned a lot today, and I'm sure our viewers did too. So a couple of things as we wrap up today. The first, Brian, is that Governor Whitmer has declared next week as Entrepreneurship Week. Any comments or remarks there?
Yeah, there was a press release that was sent out and this designation made, and it's just a nice way of, I guess, pointing to the impact that entrepreneurs make. Some of the stats that are from the mostly from the US SBA that does a state by state report each year of the impact of entrepreneurs and small business. So I thought I'd share a few of those. The In terms of the number of small business firms, as they called it in this resolution, 914,000, so almost a million. But that I want to point out that includes independent contractors. So when you hear us like advocating so forcefully for independent contractors, is because there are literally hundreds of thousands of small businesses who are single person operations, independent contractors that make a huge difference, and it's growing. There's about 1.9 million people in Michigan that are employed by small businesses. That comprises 47.9% of the workforce. So even Michigan, that has a very big presence of big businesses, our impact of our small businesses on employment is absolutely massive. Another one that I think is kind of interesting that was highlighted in here. So a total of 13,861 identified firms export from Michigan. So almost 14,000 businesses export from Michigan. Total goods worth $41.6 billion. And of those exporters, 88% of them are small businesses. So again, people think of export as being like a big business game. And but in Michigan, it really bucks the trend that most of those exporters are actually small businesses, and makes a huge huge difference. So so definitely appreciate the recognition of the impact and kind of highlighting some of those stats around. There's more stats in there as well, but next week, Entrepreneurship Week. So if you're watching this and you're an entrepreneur, which probably if you're watching this, you are an entrepreneur, cheers to you.
All right. And I just want to let everyone know we have 2 exciting owner-to-owner events coming up in February. We're going to be at Crawl Space Comedy Theater in Kalamazoo on February 21st. And so that one sounds like a lot of fun and very unique. And then we have the privilege of being at the President's House at the University of Michigan on February 28th. So 2 very cool experiences. If you're a business owner, we would love to see you in Kalamazoo on the 21st and in Ann Arbor on the 28th. If you visit sbam.org/events, you'll see an opportunity to register for those both. So
and in case, you know, because may not have registered, we're talking about Santa Ono, president of the University of Michigan, has invited us to have an owner-to-owner network meeting at his house. So kind of a cool experience to see the president, you know, see university owns a house, a university president's house, especially U of M, and even as a Spartan, I can still appreciate the opportunity to do that. So if you're a business owner and you haven't been to one of our O2O or owner-to-owner meetings, these are special because they're just for business owners. Can't have people like send salespeople and then you got all these people trying to sell to you. It's not that. This is business owners hanging out with other business owners. We try to do it in cool venues and places that otherwise you probably wouldn't be, you wouldn't have access to. So please do mark it down on your calendar and join us.
all right, everyone have a great rest of your week. Enjoy the sunshine here in Michigan today, and we'll be back here Monday at 3 p.m.
See you next time.